Well, good evening, everybody. Let's do our technical checking. Computer says it's 5:30, so we'll stick to that. Can you hear me, or is it Minnie Mouse again? It's not Minnie. Well, hopefully it'd be Mickey Mouse, not Minnie. And there should be video available, and thirdly, you should see a PowerPoint slide. So let me know right now if we're having any problems with the sound. Sometimes I'll pop in and out of the room, and that takes care of sound problems if there are any. So I'm getting all yeses that the audio must be okay. So we'll go with that. Well, I knew we had a couple of conflicts tonight, but I wasn't expecting our numbers to be this small, so I don't know if we have a late arriving crowd or if the spring breakers can't get their mind focused back on this important work. But anyway, let's go ahead and move right into this. I can't even remember if it was last week when we had class or 2 weeks ago, but regardless, whenever we last met, we had some discussion about accounting, so I thought just a little bit of taking a look back at that might be useful. Oh, thanks, Jennifer. You get your A for the night. So it just seemed like it was a month ago to me, but it was 2 weeks. But anyway, we really are obviously running out of time in this semester, so really this is going to be the last topic for us to take on. It's not really a new topic because we had, clear back at the start of the course, we did the staffing projections, which is some aspect of budget development, and our final activity in Module 5 has you use some of your resource audit findings and blend it in some with budget development. So we have it to deal with there. And also the assignment where you looked at some of the policies in your district, one of those policies you were supposed to look at was budget development. So this is not entirely new, but I had some commentary that I thought might be interesting. Is Kylie the only one having me sound like Mickey? I saw that message, so I'm pausing here. The board is lighting up. Okay, well apparently I'll try to keep talking more deliberately. That's oftentimes I start talking too quickly. So budget development, I have some information that I hope you find interesting. A little short breakout session with respect to this budget development process. We're really getting to the end of assignments, so not too much to say there, and be happy to respond to questions. So there's the agenda. We've done this 9 other times this semester, so let me assume that you're familiar with the agenda. So looking back to 2 weeks ago, I don't want to review all the material on this page. It's the exact same slide we looked at 2 weeks ago. I did want to reiterate what I said 2 weeks ago. There's the legal part of accounting and the whole aspect of you have to prove you're spending properly, legally, the fiduciary responsibility to the taxpayers, making sure you're using the funds appropriately and not taking from one fund and spending it for an inappropriate purchase. You've got all those kind of legal purposes for accounting, and let's face it, those are important and you have to follow the law, and that's just the right ethical thing to do. It's about integrity and all those kind of things. So I don't want to minimize that at all. That probably really is the preponderance of the reasons why we have standardized accounting systems in schools. But I did want to put one more plug in on this analysis piece, and I'm not speaking here just of analyzing kind of from a mechanical standpoint your expenditures, but I am suggesting that there could be very rich and fruitful ways to help your educational planning just by setting up some accounting processes that report information to decision makers that's useful to them, whether it's for planning for budgets or trying to monitor spending to see if you're spending on things that you have identified as priorities in your school improvement planning. There are ways to use accounting for making educational decisions, not just for these kind of legal compliance reasons. So as I suggested 2 weeks ago, everybody who's in this room right now has more than enough to do, and many of you at this point in your jobs don't even have financial responsibilities. But I would say to you, just kind of file that away in the back of your mind. There may be at some point in your career when you do have some of these financial responsibilities, you might remember what I'm suggesting here, that between you and your bookkeeper, it could be very easy for you to set up some processes to put some account numbers in place that you want to monitor for making decisions about budgets and trying to make sure you're actually funding your educational priorities. So I just wanted to suggest to you that accounting can help with educational programming also. I'm going to keep moving. You're welcome to offer any comments along the way. Just a quick review again. Wanted to remind you from 2 weeks ago the whole notion that in public schools, using public dollars to fund those schools, we often run into the restrictions that come from the particular fund that the taxpayers were told they would be supporting with their contributions through their tax dollars. And SPLOST, as I used as an example 2 weeks ago, is the most obvious example of a very specific and limited fund that the taxpayers have been directly told it's to serve a certain purpose. So just a reminder of that, and one more reminder of the numbering system. It's a consistent system of identifying a group of funds, the functions, the objects, the program. I remember it as the FFOP, but just to re-emphasize the point of what we had 2 weeks ago, this is an example we had 2 weeks ago, just being able to understand that these numbers are related to those different accounts that are identified on a school system's chart of accounts. You can easily track these back to the chart of accounts, so this is nothing that should cause anybody to be concerned or confused that it's something very complicated. It's not. And one thing I didn't mention 2 weeks ago that I wanted to mention to you, along with these numbers that represent the account stream or the account funds, you also may often see another number in there, or two numbers, like in this case 14 for the year 2014. You may see that also in this string of numbers, and tells you, for example, that the funds are coming from fiscal year 2014 or fiscal year 2015. So you may see some other numbers in there that are just simply telling you what year of budget that the expenditure is being funded from. So with having said that, that's our trip down memory lane from 2 weeks ago. Just wanted to again emphasize to you, you don't have to be a CPA to understand this. You just need to know enough to know what questions to ask, the things to monitor, things to pay attention. And I would also suggest know enough that this is potentially a tool that could help you with decision making at some point. So I guess we really need to head into our final topic, really of the semester. I wanted to share some stuff regarding putting a budget together that I hope you find useful. So obviously you can tell me if it's not. So I have a few things to say, then we'll have a short breakout session that would be directly related to this idea of budget building. So I feel your excitement out there, and I thought I heard a lot of crying and carrying on when I suggested that this is really our last topic. We always run out of time before we run out of topics. So I guess Dawn is the only one who gets the A for the night. She gets the second A for the night. I can't remember who had the first one. I have to go back and look at the archive. It was it Jennifer? I'm trying to remember. Who's going to claim credit for that? Okay, Jennifer. I knew if it was you, you'd speak right up too. Okay, well, there are 10 people in this room counting me, so there ought to be at least 18 eyes filling up with tears as I suggested that. So maybe some of you are carrying on more publicly than others. The rest of you are trying to mask your tears. It's okay to show emotion. I'm a crier myself, so I won't be bothered if anybody wants to cry. Okay, enough of that. So everybody's ready now. Have your attention. Just wanted to make sure that we're on the same page on this. You know, what is a budget? Well, I would call it an estimate, and I chose that word carefully. And really what it represents is an estimate of your revenue, the money you are expecting to be coming in for a given period of time, and then the expenses, the money that you are anticipating or estimating that you will be needing to spend for that period of time. Now, in schools, most of us are used to a budget that's based upon a fiscal year, so we're generally talking about a period of time of 12 months. Now, there may be some budgets in capital improvements, like, for example, if you're budgeting to add on to a new school or to build a new school, obviously that budgeting process is probably going to involve more than a 12-month fiscal year. A lot of school systems try to save up money over a period of, say, 3 to 5 years before they even want to think about initiating some kind of a large construction project. So it's not always a given that the time period for a budget is a 12-month period, but that's the most common framework that we'd be thinking about. Of course, we know the calendar starts a new year in January, on January 1, and the old year ends in December. School budgets and most governmental budgets operate under a fiscal year where July 1st starts the new fiscal year and June 30th ends the old fiscal year. So we would be in fiscal year 2015 starting on this July 1st of 2014, because that budget would go on in until June 30th of 2015. So we're really rapidly getting close now to FY fiscal year 15, even though it's only the 4th month of year 2014. So just making sure we're on the same page on that. Why do we use fiscal years? Well, a lot of that, particularly for governmental entities, relates to, like, for example, when the legislature meets in Georgia. Obviously, many of our dollars come from the General Assembly, and the legislature just finished, so they have made certain dollar amounts available for fiscal year 15. So a lot of times this calendar is really driven by, for example, when a state's legislature would meet and have the ability to kind of know what kind of money is going to be available based upon revenue that's been coming in for the last X number of months. So it is confusing, I'll grant you that, and there may be even some areas of your budget that actually follow the calendar year. You may, within your system, some budgets may reset or monies may be swept at the end of the calendar year, so that makes it even more confusing at times if you have some parts of the budget that are following a calendar year and other parts, most parts, that are following some kind of a fiscal year. That adds to confusion. I'm going to keep going until I see anybody with commentary or questions. Here are a number of points. I guess this is about 7 bullets on this page. I'm calling these tensions in the budget development process. See if these things are true in your school settings. Some of these are going to be more true in certain communities than they are perhaps in your community, but let's see. Obviously, the bad economy that the United States has been in for at least the last 6 years has placed a real tension on the budget development process. There really hasn't been much in terms of budget planning in very many places the last 6 years because it's really been about just scraping together enough money to kind of hold where you are and not have to reduce the number of people or positions and trying to maybe minimize furlough days and those kind of things. So the bad economy has certainly put a real cramp on any kind of budget development process. Now, in some communities, the tax rate is already maxed out, so there may be pressures to reduce that tax rate, but the more common scenario is a board, because remember, the school board is setting those millage rates. A lot of times there's significant pressure on school board members to keep those rates as low as possible and perhaps even reduce those rates. When the economy is bad, it's putting a lot of pressure on people to pay taxes when you know people are hurting, and school board members are elected by people. So there's a political dynamic here. It's not just what the school says they want or need in terms of a millage rate to support schools. There's the political pressure that the school board members who are elected by those communities are oftentimes feeling pressure to try to reduce those rates because people are hurting. And then there's the third factor. I'm not an economist, but I personally believe, and I think I could make a strong case if we had more time, I think it's not good for the economy to raise taxes. I just generally think the economy, I personally think the economy does better when taxes are at as low a rate as possible. So yes, I'm conservative on that issue, but I'm just trying to make the case. I'm not trying to make a political argument now. I'm just trying to make the case that most people would agree there's some relationship between the tax rate and the overall economic health of an area. I, for example, look at the tax rate before I decide where I want to live. And if it's a high tax area, I particularly choose to not want to live there and don't choose to live there. So there are economic decisions and repercussions to the tax rate. And those things vary from community to community. Let me stop talking for just 15 seconds and see if I can get you to respond to something. How many of you know that this is a tough issue in your community for your school board members, that they're under pressure to keep the tax rates low? How many of you know that this is a real issue in your community? I'm getting some yeses here because this is absolutely the time that board members have to make these decisions, because this is the time when your budgets and etc. need to be certified and go through that process so they can go into effect for the next fiscal year. So I'm very sympathetic to board members who are really in a difficult place on this. They want to be supportive of the schools. They want to have the best schools possible. They want to be able to not have to riff teachers and do the furlough days, but at the same time, they're living in that community and they're hearing a lot and they're getting a lot of pressure to not raise taxes. So, okay, I see several of you commenting that that's a real issue in your place. Let's keep moving then. Again, you're welcome to jump in anywhere. Another tension is oftentimes between certain elements of the budget, arguably could be budgeted at the school level or it could be budgeted at the district level. And sorting that out is very interesting to watch different decisions that are made in different communities. Let me give one example on this. Let's just say buying paper. We know that schools are still using thousands and thousands of pieces of paper every school year. So here's the example. Should the district buy paper in huge bulk, thinking you're going to get and will get a better price because you're buying, millions of pieces of paper? So the district buys it, district budgets for it, district budget handles that, or would it make more sense for the paper to be budgeted at the school level? And if the principal knew, pardon me, that he or she had to pay for that paper out of their school budget, then I guess you could argue that maybe they would use that paper more cost effectively, and maybe frivolous printing wouldn't be done as much because the principal would be closer, or the principal's designee would be closer to monitor that. That's what I'm talking about, is an obvious kind of tension. There's some items that you could argue should be budgeted perhaps both at the school level and the district level. So there's not necessarily a right answer on that. Teachers' benefits, in this case, I'm talking about health insurance, is a real tension right now. And I just read an article today that the insurance premiums have increased more in this past year than they ever have in history. And again, this is not a political statement, but we all know with Obamacare, we have a very influx situation with respect to how this country is going to handle health care in the future. But this is what I'm talking about. That's a real tension in the budget because the cost of insurance for teachers, and I'm using teachers as an example because there are so many more teachers than other employees, this is a real tension in budgets. Elizabeth says, isn't that a state budget issue? It certainly is, but the problem is that it's costing the state so much, and the state is counting that as money that's funding schools. Then we get shortchanged on our QBE and we get shortchanged on our equalization funds because the state has spent such a large portion of funds for teachers' insurance. So I'm just trying to make the point that insurance, in this case we're talking about health insurance, is a very, very costly item that's having real impacts on school budgets. Has been for years, but it doesn't seem to be any end in sight. And as I indicated, insurance premiums have gone up more this year than they ever have, at least according to the study that I read today. Another tension, I'm taking too much time on this, sorry. Another tension that's often prevalent in the budget development process is whether we should have educators making these budget decisions or whether schools are better served, particularly in their central office, by having financial people that are professional accountants. This is a tension in many systems, maybe in larger systems more than smaller ones, but it is an honest tension about, are these really financial issues that should have financial professionals, people that are trained as financial people making these decisions, or are we better served at having educators in these decision-making roles who have been first trained as an educator and then secondarily now are becoming expert in financial matters? That's a tension. Another tension we've already discussed, and again, your comments are welcome, are the limitations based upon the funds, in terms of, back to our accounting example, that we have fund restrictions. That's a real tension because you may have one fund that has a huge surplus and another fund that's in a deficit, but you can't flip those, you can't transfer the funds because of legal limitations. And then finally, I posted a sample instructional budget. It's item 5.7, and in that sample, that system does its allocation purely on a per pupil basis. So however many assistant principals you get is determined by a per pupil basis. How many counselors you get is determined per pupil. How many copy machines you get is determined per pupil. So that's the most obvious way to allocate items from the district office, is based on a per pupil basis. But there are other ways. For example, if you have a very high needs or high at-risk population in a school, you may want to allocate an extra social worker or extra counselor, just as a for example. So there are other variables that could be considered in the allocation process in addition to just the enrollment. So these are a half dozen or 7 items that often flash up in tension when you're trying to put a budget together. I think we've got a comment to look at from Justin here. I'm sorry, let's take a moment to look at that. Oh, that's interesting. I had kind of assumed that the smaller districts oftentimes are having 1 or 2 people, and I think Jean's here now. I know she wouldn't mind me using her as an example. I know Jean has worn a lot of different hats in her district. She's been in a lot of different roles, and frequently, I think in a smaller system, they have people that have to serve multiple functions, multiple hats. So that's what I was thinking, that it's probably oftentimes they don't even have the ability in a real small district to have one person dedicated to one assignment. They have to wear several hats. And Jennifer, now I'm reading Jennifer's comments. Certainly, I'm sure that's on target too. I can remember in the past couple of years, students that I've had in class that were instructional coaches asked me to help them try to develop the strongest case possible because they knew their positions were on the verge of being eliminated, so they wanted my help to try to think about trying to convince the school board or whoever they had to convince, the superintendent, that they added a lot of value to the system, and it would be a mistake to try to eliminate those positions. So good comment on that too. Okay, well, let me go to my next slide. Your comments are welcome. Continue firing them at me here. Just to continue to think about the budget planning process, as already indicated, it's been very limited in most districts. I think that's really disappointing because the budget should be a representative of your priorities in your system, but in the recent years it's just been, how do we survive? It hasn't been how do we plan most effectively. This is another comment that I think is true probably in 90+% of the systems in Georgia, is that this budget process is controlled in the central office. There are very few systems that are allowing much autonomy or much participation even, quite frankly, from the school level. Now, I know of some. I know that Fulton County has a process that's been included in a lot of school finance textbooks where they have given some additional authority to school-based teams as far as making budget decisions. That's pretty unique and has gotten Fulton County some pats on the back kind of across the country. And I also know that Troup County, their new superintendent, I guess it's not so new anymore, it's a couple of years, and I can't even recall his name right now. I knew I was going to blank out. They have done a very sophisticated process recently of basically zeroing out their budgets each year, starting at zero in their budgets, and then finding through kind of a series of meetings, decisions are actually made about what gets back in the budget and what doesn't get back in the budget based upon presentations about its effectiveness or its ineffectiveness. So that's another example where I know that not every decision is being made in the central office. Another challenge, I think, is that there's often just a few people that are allowed to be involved or that are perceived to have the expertise or the time to do this work. And I know this last one is a real kick in the gut right now, but once you pay for your people, your teachers, your custodians, your whatever, your administrators, once you pay for those people's salaries and their benefits, at best you might have 10% of the budget left. So 90% is spent after you develop your staffing plan for your system. So there's very little left. You're really fighting over crumbs, that final 10%. I see Elizabeth made a comment from her audit about Gwinnett allowing some input on staffing allocations and FTE. And if I recall, in the past, Gwinnett had a point system, and I assume that you still have it, where principals can earn and can make some decisions about expending some of those points if they want to make some different decisions as far as their allocation. So I'm assuming that's still the case. So that's another example of some control that's not in the central office and is being allowed to be exercised at the school level. Trying to see if I missed anything. Jennifer's comment I missed. Well, remember that perspective, Jennifer, because that's where I'm going with the breakout sessions, just to have you to have some conversation about what would it be like if you had a more participatory process. And as you said, I think it does offer pros and cons, but I think it's worth us spending a few minutes thinking about that, because again, the assumption is you guys are current and future leaders. You're going to have some say-so in the future about what kind of processes there should be. And I think for the most part, in most areas, we assume there's going to be more participation as we move through the 21st century. But this financial area has been one where people have been intimidated or afraid, or we've really, with some good reasons, been much more judicious in who gets into these participations, and more often than not, they're pretty much a closed kind of a process. Let's keep moving. Comments are continued to be welcome. One of the things that I wanted you to think about, because we're going to do it in the breakout session, but that's because Jennifer just brought us to that point, is to have some basis to think about who should participate. Let me start at this bottom, the test of jurisdiction. These are in the literature. I just wanted to mention to you there are ways to kind of decide, reasonably try to decide who should be involved in a budget planning process. But if you're in a system where the central office, the district office, is going to make all those decisions and they're going to maintain jurisdiction over this issue, then applying the test of jurisdiction to that, it wouldn't make any sense to have a school-based process for budget development if you're not allowed any jurisdiction over that issue. So kind of the first level of test to determine how to proceed with this participation aspect of budget planning is, if you're not going to be given any authority or not even going to be listened to at all, then there's no point in even having the process. So the first level, I would argue, is the test of jurisdiction. If you have jurisdiction, if you're told, no, you can have some input, you can have some say-so, you can have some responsibility, you can have some authority, if you pass that test of jurisdiction, then I think you can think about who is the budget relevant to and who has expertise
that might be useful to be on a budget kind of a team or a planning team. So let's go back to relevance. Anybody who gets a paycheck or spends any school funds for supplies or materials, you could argue this is a relevant conversation to them. So whether it's a custodian, a secretary, a teacher, you could easily argue that all of those people, that budget is relevant to them. So it's kind of easy to pass that test. But then when you start thinking about expertise in terms of who might have a perspective or a set of skills or a certain knowledge base that would be useful, then it starts to become a lot more discriminating in terms of people that you can think of that might really have the expertise. And I think you quickly realize that if you're going to involve a lot of people that maybe really don't know that much about this topic, that you're probably going to have to invest some time in developing those people. You're probably going to have some kinds of information sessions, learning sessions before a parent or a custodian or even a teacher can really contribute very much to the process. So if you're not committed to spending some time to get those people at a level that they can contribute something, then I think you have to have some thought about whether it's really useful to have them a part of the process. But you may want them to be involved for other reasons. And that's the kind of things that I would like you to talk about in a moment here in the breakout session. So this gives you some basis, though, to think about rather than just kind of flying by the seat of your pants. Do we have jurisdiction on this issue? Is it relevant to this person? And then finally, is there an expertise there? Or if we spent some time, could we develop some expertise in that person? And there are other things to think about in terms of how committed somebody is. You know, you don't want to spend a lot of time trying to educate and develop somebody and then have them to not really be that committed to it. So my last comments on this page, just different ways to think about a budget. A mechanical budget is simply that. It's the listing of what you intend to earn in revenue and what you intend to spend in terms of expenses. It's a very limited kind of a view of a budget. But a functional budget is when you've done more due diligence to try to filter in the educational needs. You've done some activities and had some interactions to try to identify what your educational priorities are. That's more of a functional budget, and I hope almost everybody can say that their budget is functional. So let me ask the question. Nobody will tell anybody. We have the Las Vegas rule in this class. All of you that can hear me right now, let's see if you can type either, if you're working in a school system that has a budget and you have a basis to make a comment on this, how many of you would say your budget is mechanical? Go ahead and type mechanical if you think it's just a mechanical budget, or type functional if you think you found evidence and believe there's evidence that there are processes where you really are trying to get at the priorities, the educational priorities. Well, I'm getting a lot of functionals, and I'm pleased to see that. Ooh, we do have a mechanical. I was hoping we could avoid that. That's like a naughty word in this. But we've gotten more mechanical budgets in recent years, again, as the funds have dwindled and the processes have decreased because people have not felt that they're worth putting time into something when you're not going to have enough money to do anything anyway. So fair enough, Dawn. I think that may be the case for a lot of people. And then my final comments on this slide, just how participatory, like who is involved. Do we have 3 people in the central office doing this? Is it the board president and the superintendent and the chief financial officer? Or the contrary to that would be, are we really letting decisions being made at the site, at the school site? And one thing I mentioned earlier that they're doing in Troup County, and as part of our Module 5, our last activity in the course, is some thought about a zero-based budget process where you really start at zero every year in the budget and build back up from zero, whereas in reality, most systems start, the 2015 budget picks up kind of right where the 2014 left off. But in a zero-based budget, 2015 starts at zero and you build it back up from zero. I'm almost done talking. This is my last slide. Oh, I heard some more crying out there. It's okay. Try to control yourselves. On this slide, and my last slide of the night for my comments, I kind of listed in what I think is decreasing order what typically you would find in a budget in terms of the amounts of dollars appropriated and the amount of expenses. So in most budgets, you're going to find personnel and benefits to be, as I already suggested, like 90% of everything is going to be right there in those items, those lines of the budget that pay for the people and pay for their benefits. Then, in many systems, the next highest expense that you can find is going to be your energy expenses, whether it's heating, lighting, and air conditioning, your parking lot lights, etc. Many schools have very expensive electric bills. So for many systems, that might be your second highest expense in your system. A third level is when you get at supplies and equipment. That might include furniture, it might include computers, but for a lot of systems that might be like your third most heavily funded items in the budget. Your property insurance, all your buildings are insured, of course. I'm sure we're aware of that, but insurance, even property and liability insurance, if you're sued, your liability coverage, these are areas where expenses have been increasing significantly. I don't know in your own personal family if you are aware of like what you pay to insure your home and what you're paying now for car insurance, but my property and car insurances have been exploding the last 6 or 7 years. So many people are suing other people, and we've had a lot of catastrophes with weather, whether it's hail damage, people getting free roofs or turning in roofs on their insurance, and damages from tornadoes we've experienced a lot here in the Southeast. Individuals and schools both have been paying a lot more to insure their facilities and to insure themselves from the liability of lawsuits, children being injured on playgrounds or in physical education class, etc. So for a lot of people, or a lot of systems rather, this has been an increasing cost. And then way down here, like number 5 or so, in a lot of systems, we finally see professional development, and then of course there are a lot of other miscellaneous expenses. What I was simply trying to show in this final slide is that once you pay everybody and pay for their benefits, there's just not a lot left, and a lot of the things that you have to pay for don't directly seem to really be helping kids. Now obviously, they need a nice piece of furniture to sit in, and they need a room that's not too cold or too hot, and they need lights in the room. So yes, it is supporting the children's education, but you think about developing your people and developing teachers, and there's just not much money left by the time you get down to that level. And I know it's a frustration for those of you that are interested in professional learning that there's just not much left, but that's the reality. It takes a lot of work to drive up those PD numbers to anything at all remotely where people want them to be. So let's